Yes, sir.
Oh, okay, good. Thank you very much, Yanwa. Um, Good morning, everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And I'm going to conduct this in English because, well, welcome to a guest lecture on airport
Yes, sir.
governance um, by my former teacher, Professor Doug Baker. So I'd like to thank you all for coming. This is not as large as your previous two classes because we do only have about 30 master students at the moment, and some of them are joining us online because we do have a long distance learning scheme. And some of the students that you talked to earlier are still in their final or the final year, fourth final year of their undergraduate studies. They're from the fast track program that I talked to you about last night, the acceleration program. We also have some regular schemes, but I think they're all joining us online as well. So I'll try and be fair and give equal opportunity to discuss both for our participants online and offline. So yeah, but that's my brief introduction. Take it away, Doug.
Thanks very much for having me. When I was told that you wanted a lecture for master's students and postgraduate, we call it postgraduate in Australia, I had to think, all right, how do I pitch it? Because I mostly teach fourth year students. I only teach fourth year students and usually PhD students. We don't have a master's program. So I thought, well, I'm going to make it for master's students. And I used to teach master's students at my last university in British Columbia. I think that you need to understand some basic concepts to cover some very basic concepts in planning and in transportation research that are going to be that should be important to you. Despite I sort of get a feel for where you're going in terms of your research. There seems to be a bit of transport, a bit of city access, a bit of equity, and I heard the word evaluation twice. So that's an important part of a master's thesis, and that's evaluation. So I want to talk about the aerotropolis, or the airport city. Now, the reason I want to talk about this is because in 2007, before most of you were born, about 15 years ago, I received a very, very, very large research grant from the Australian government to pull in teams from Europe and the United States and Australia to evaluate the aerotropolis concept. It was a concept that had been started by Jack Cassarda in the United States at University of North Carolina, which is a very big university in the United States. His idea of the aerotropolis and the emerging role of the airport needed to be tested because there was no empirical research. Nobody had done any research on it. I wrote a research grant, and the Australian government gave me millions of dollars to evaluate it. This is one of the sort of areas we looked at. I'm going to talk about one slim cut of some of the research. And we produced a lot of papers. We produced a lot of research. I spoke around the world, China, the United States, Europe, Africa, on the airport city concept. So the airport city notion, the idea, comes out of Cassarda's research. And what I want to talk today about is the idea of governance. So I'm going to be asking you questions because you're graduate students, postgraduate students. You need to interact with me, otherwise I get bored. And that's not good. Let's see. We have a limited range with this projector. No, that's okay. I'll just move in closer. Is this on or off? There we are. See how fancy that is? That's me. a presentation, you guys, you know this, when you're doing a presentation, you have the title and the outline. This is where I'm going. I want to talk about the airport city concept and what it is, because it's really an urban design concept. It's really an explanation of a certain part of the city. I want to talk about the concept of governance and what that means and why it's important. Next, stakeholders. What are stakeholders and how do you evaluate stakeholders? Then I want to go to network theory. So we're going to move from governance to network theory and stakeholder networks. And then lastly, I want to talk about how the airport needs to integrate this into building relationships. So this is one very small part of the airport city research that we did. I had many professors working on this, experts in governance, experts in network analysis, and they contributed to this research. So the idea of the airport being connected to the city and how airports relate to cities is a relatively new concept. Airports haven't been around that long. 150 years ago, they didn't exist. And in the history of the built environment, that's a nanosecond. However, if we look at some of the sketches from the 20s, Earl Bell's Moon Dome, we can see that this is 1928, just after the biplanes, and we can see that there's a landing strip on top of that building. Lindy and Lewis's design for Liverpool Station during the Second World War, you can see there's airport landing strips on top of the buildings. So the idea of the city being integrated with air traffic has been around for a century. King's Cross was being redone in London, and Charles Glover came up in 1931 with the idea of having an airport right in the middle of the city on a hub. And so the planes could land and go around. Now, this hub idea is being used right now in some of the bigger airports in the world where they fly and it's a circular path and they can move more efficiently in a wheel and spoke configuration. But 1931, that was only 90 years ago. Now, of course, this isn't going to happen. You're not going to have 787s dropping down into the middle of the city. Why not? Why isn't that a good idea? Any ideas? Safety, because they crash. What else? Noise. Planes are loud. I don't know if you noticed that. Well, is there any other reason? Have you ever smelled those jets? A lot of pollution. So there's a variety of reasons why we don't drop big jets in the middle of the city. Makes sense. However, at this time period, the planes are quite small. They're relatively small compared to what we have now. And believe it or not, our planes are getting smaller than they were in 1990 or 2000. They're not making the A380 anymore. Why? Inefficient. It sucks up more fuel than two jets. The new A350s and the new 787s are all carbon-bodied, high-efficiency engines. And we're looking at a new supersonic jet modeled on the French planes that will now exceed Mach 1. Most of our planes now fly about 700 miles per hour. These new planes are doubling that distance so that you can get in a plane and fly directly from Sydney to New York, from Sydney or Brisbane to anywhere in the world in one shot, no stop, and very quickly. So the Concorde, the French Concorde, used to be able to fly from New York to Paris in 3 hours. So we're looking at different types of planes and different speeds. COVID put a real dent in the air traffic industry, but it seems to be coming back with a vengeance. How do you like that? So the Germans in 1927, before they thought they could take over the world, had a model for airplanes landing in the city, again, center of the city. Have you heard of Le Corbusier? Have you studied Le Corbusier, the French architect who designed the Le Ville Radieuse, the radiant city in the 20s? He also had airplanes dropping in the middle. So in urban planning, there's been this fascination of airplanes and the city, that combination. So it's not a new concept that Casarda introduced in the late 90s. It's not a new concept. It's always been there, and it's been needling away with all sorts of design. So, given that, the airport city was born out of Casarda's earlier work in the late 90s, and it's been around a long time. I'll give you this article. I was sent a review article by Rob Freestone, who's probably the most preeminent planner in Australia. And he worked with me on this airport city, but there's just an article published last week, and it's published in 2023. It's coming up. But it really summarizes a lot of the research around the aerotropolis. But it's the airport city, the aerotropolis, the airport metropolis are all synonyms. They're all the same thing. They refer to the same idea. The area is a Finnish concept where they took the aerotropolis and fitted it to the fins. Right? So you'll see a lot of that literature around the same thing. And the bottom line is it's an airport and it's a city unto itself. It serves a certain function. And I'll talk a little bit about it, but not too much. But it constructs the airport around the concept of being the center of a city. So it's a new urban form based around the airport. Secondly, it's the new connection to other airports around the world. If you think about it, airports are sort of the portal that link each other. It's not, so when you fly into Indonesia, and this is what I found interesting coming into Indonesia, because this is my first time here. I thought, okay, Surabaya, second largest city, it should be a direct flight to Brisbane. But not. Why? When I fly into the second largest city in Canada, if I fly into Toronto or Vancouver, direct links. Why not? Surabaya. Okay, that's a good point. Demand not so high. Where's the demand? Not Jakarta. It's Bali. Bali is the portal for Indonesia. It's a portal because it is one of the world's tourist destinations. Bali is right up there in terms of world destinations. So the Indonesian government uses Bali as the entrance, and then all flights linking out of Bali. Makes sense. So airports have a way of talking to each other in terms of access. And when you're somebody like me, I travel all over the world. I look for direct connections to the airports, and I often just fly into a city. I flew into Durban, South Africa. It was a 24-hour flight. I met with airport executives, gave a talk, and flew out. I didn't even look at the city or South Africa. I didn't see any elephant. And that's the way of modern business now. It's airports connecting with airports. And the airport city is the facilitator of that, where there's hotels, conference centers, recreation, and we don't leave that point because our time is money. And so when you want to meet face to face, that's what you do. So business is a contact sport. Means you meet eye to eye if you're dealing with a lot of money. You don't do it on Zoom. So this notion of airports being global connectors in the 21st century has really happened with the increased mobility and the increased technology around airplanes. It's really changed. So the modern global economy is really based around the construct of airports and airport supply chains. Larger things like cars, the global supply chain is slightly different. It's ships. But for very high value parts, it's airplanes that take those parts. So the airport city is a modern construct on and a modern take on the role of the airport within the urban fabric. Casarda makes the great point that in the 18th century, it was ports. And we were talking about ports in Indonesia yesterday. That, in fact, the Dutch built the ports here first to get the raw materials out as quickly as possible. Yeah, you know, the colonial powers did that. They did it in Canada, they did it in China, they did it in Indonesia, right? They came and took what they could. And how did they do it? They built ports. In Sydney and in Australia, they built the ports and they colonized the Aboriginals very quickly. And then they built their cities. And cities are a way of colonizing as well. Planning is one of the most insidious instruments to colonize because you build the cities and you populate it with your people and it transplants the indigenous people. That's an article that should be written. Cities as colonial tools. I digress. In the 19th century, though, it was railroads. So in the 1800s, that's what you know, the building of the railroads are what united Canada. They started from the east in Ontario and in Quebec, and they built the Trans-Canada Railroad right across to British Columbia, and that connected the provinces around the railroad, and the provinces became provinces following the 1867 declaration of the country. Same as Australia, but Australia is a little disjointed. The Americans did the same thing. The movement of the railroads across to the west colonized, pretty much colonized the entire country. So the railroads were the connector to cities within each country. The ports were really the connectors to the colonies for trade, and cities developed around those. Railroads, the same thing. The same thing. Railroads often were the foundation of the towns and cities. And in Canada, the Canadian Pacific Railroad, when it was moving across, they used the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E. So this town would be Aberfoyle, the next town would be Bedford, the next town would be C, Clifford, D, whatever. And all the towns went to Z, and then they started again. So you can sort of see the alphabet as you go across Canada and the towns that are along the railroad. No imagination. So railroads were the sort of builder of countries. It was the connector of cities, and it was the formation of cities in the interiors. And it also connected ports, that technology. But in the 20th century, my century, yours is the 21st, but in my century, it was the good old automobile. It was the building of the freeways post-war across the United States, the freeway system, in Australia as well, post-war, so in the 50s and 60s, the building of the freeways that really changed cities. The urban form impact of the automobile was immense, immense. First, personal mobility allowed people to live out of the city. So what happened was that you had decayed inner cities in the United States, and you had all the people like us yuppies here. We lived outside of that in our, I don't know, half a hectare home, and we could drive into work and then drive back. And as a result, the centers of the cities in the 60s and 70s decayed and became ghettos in the United States and in Canada and places. But gradually that changed. The commute got further and further and further out. This area became more attractive and became higher density, and people lived in those areas and worked in the same area. But the automobile and highways were a major change of urban form, as you know. Shopping malls, when you could drive and shop in luxury and air conditioning and go back, was heaven. You didn't have to travel any distance for food. You could do it all in a shopping mall. So the idea is that the automobile provided that personal freedom, and it changed the scale and scope of what we did. And it absolutely skewed the environmental impacts of the automobile. Good examples are the large cities and the pollution resulting from the automobile. So each of these transport modes changed how we live, changed our urban form, and changed how we work. Makes sense. Well, in the 21st century, Quesada argues it's airports. It's the new one. Now, that was the argument. I never believed it. I never believed that our airports would have that impact. And so I set out to do research on that and to look at that. I used to have a team of graphic artists that worked for me, so I bring these old slides up every once in a while just because I spent the money. But the argument is the airport is all of these things. It's an international corridor. It's a connector, much like the highways were and the railways before them and the ports before them. And it impacts governance, infrastructure, land use, and economic development. And it impacts the metropolitan area and the region. So it has, the argument is that it has these impacts, and it will precede the ports, the roads, and the railroad in its impact. Oops. That's good. So it's an interface and a global linkage. As our globe gets smaller, airports play a bigger role. The chances of me lecturing to you a century ago were almost zero. Even 50 years ago, almost zero. The only reason it's easy to come here is it's a dead easy flight. 5 hours to Bali from Brisbane, and then 35 minutes here. Nothing. And I even ate lunch on the way. It was great. So it's easy. And anybody working in travel behavior knows that things that are easy to do generally are done. All right. So you get the idea of the airport city and its role. A good example of an airport city is Fraport. Has anybody flown into Frankfurt? It's stunning, isn't it? It's a stunning airport. You drop right in. It is huge. You come into a large kind of dome, much like Beijing, and in the dome are hotels and shopping inside this massive dome. And inside all the shopping and hotels, down one level, are trains, connecting trains regionally, and down another level are fast trains. So the last time I was in Frankfurt, I flew Brisbane, Singapore, Frankfurt. I dropped down to my favorite hotel. I got in at about 9 o'clock at night. I climbed into bed, woke up at 5, climbed out of bed, walked downstairs, got a ticket on a fast train, and in 2 hours, I was in Paris. Like that. Easy. Fraport is one of these sort of airport cities that's touted around the world in terms of its design and how it connects. It never used to be, but they've designed the airport city around this concept. If you look at the airport city, it has 130 shops, over 130 shops, restaurants, bars, and cafes, 500 different businesses at Fraport. Conference centers, I've flown in there and spoken and flew out. Logistics, it's a massive logistics center, one of the largest in the world. I think there's a range here. So there's economic access, as I said, regional, rail, and road, and also international. 70,000 people work at that airport. That's a lot. And it's Germany's single largest employer. So that gives you an idea of the scale of this import and of this airport and the impact of it. Dubai. The Arabs decided they were going to design their airports around the airport city, because when we were doing the research in around 2004, 2005, 2006, they were building Dubai, they were building the airport, and they were very keen on building it around the airport city concept. And they did. And it was their goal in the Emirates to be the primary airport hub in the world. Now, they're really not located in a great hub location. So how did they do it? Like everything, they threw a lot of money. They bought a whole fleet of A380s. That's the biggest jet in the world. It has, have you flown an A380? It has 2 floors. It is massive. And they bought a whole bunch of them. And they developed their airport in a very sophisticated way. They built it around the airport city concept with a logistics city, a commercial city, golf resorts, aviation city, exhibition city, residential city. So they built this whole city concept in the airport itself. And it is a massive airport. The last time I was there, they were rebuilding a few things because the heat is so intense, it degrades the structures very quickly. It was a mess, actually, the last time I was there. But it is a huge, huge airport, and it is a massive complex around the airport that services the airport. It's international in its scale. So if you look at how they've structured it, they've got a free trade zone, they've got an international airport zone, and they've got a logistics city. So, when we're looking at the airport city or the aerotropolis, we'll use the term interchangeably, you have to think, what are the key elements in this urban form? We'll call it an urban form because it is really. What are the elements and synergies that link the airport to its surrounding region? So if the airport's here, what are the elements that link it to the city? How does it connect? Is there a relationship? And what are the important elements that affect the governance and how the airport manages itself? And how does it manage change? And how is the airport city connected to its stakeholders in managing collaboration? How does it manage collaboration? Because traditionally airports don't collaborate. They're a federal responsibility, and they do what they choose because their economic impact is so important. So what I want to talk about is a little bit about how this urban form is connected to the metropolitan form and how is it managed? How is it planned? So I came up with the concept of interfaces, the idea of interfaces. And what this concept means is that there's certain interfaces between the airport metropolis or the airport city and its clients. And the things that affect these interfaces are infrastructure, governance, land use planning, and economic development. All 4 of those elements or interfaces affect the airport and how it interacts with the surrounding city and region and even international community. So infrastructure, of course, is transport, how you connect to other airports, what your business model is, and the networks. For example, Fraport that we talked about has a very strong relationship with Xi'an Airport in China. It owns 50% of Xi'an. Schiphol Airport in the Netherlands owns 17% of Brisbane Airport. So these airports are all connected. Sydney Airport the ownership of Sydney Airport is connected with two airports in France. I forget which two, because they're all uniquely owned. So the whole construct of networks is important with airports. And sometimes some airports don't play with other airports. No different than countries, right? Governance. Now, this is a master's level word, and I'll talk a little bit about governance. But it's the legislation and policy, it's the institutional arrangement, and it's the public-private partnerships. Because airports aren't always public. Australia, for example, the airports aren't owned by the public or the government. They're privately owned, all of them. They were all sold off in 1999, 2000 to private companies. Adelaide Airport, for example, is owned by the Canadian Teachers Pension Fund. Yeah, the Canadian Teachers Pension Fund, which is huge. Canadians like security, and security lies in, we're very conservative, security lies in infrastructure. So the pension fund, which is a massive amount, they bought Adelaide Airport, and now the profits from Adelaide Airport go to the Canadian high school teachers and primary school teachers. But bad people also own airports, such as the Macquarie Bank owned Sydney Airport. And Macquarie is renowned as an asset runner-downer. So what it'll do is buy an asset, it'll run that asset down, and it sells it. And they did just that with Sydney Airport. And that's why Sydney Airport's so shoddy. There was no revenue generated back into the airport. But at least there's new owners in Sydney Airport. So airports in Australia are privately owned, and there's a variety of other privately owned airports. But in the United States, they're all public, and in Canada, they're public. So we have different ownerships and relationships across airports. Okay? So the governance is really important. Land use planning. You guys are planners. I guess you're planners. Hey, it's a master's in planning. Well, it's about resource use, social impacts, environmental impacts, and the whole notion of master planning, because airports aren't community planned, they're master planned. It's a different type of plan. So that's very important, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that. Economic development is very, very important for airports because they're economic drivers. And often when they're driving the economics, they, in order to borrow for their assets, they claim very large amounts of importance to what they do to the economy. I've just published a paper last year saying, well, maybe it isn't as much as they claim because nobody's measured it, but we did a measure of it, and it isn't a big deal. It's significant, but it's not a big deal. So the airport-related development, if you think of it in terms of circles, like a bullseye, is located at the airport. It's all the logistics, all the stuff that we do at the airport. But it has commercial development around. So many airports own commercial interests all the way around, like car leases, car rentals, parking. And then if we even go around that, there's often regional economic development. Airports have their fingers in the regions that service the airport. So the interfaces are a way, this is a conceptual framework. Do you know what a conceptual framework is, as opposed to an analytical framework? Come on, give. No? Right? A conceptual framework looks at and structures the theory with the empirical reality and gives you a diagram. So this is a conceptual framework because the airport city is a theoretical approach. It's not real. It doesn't exist. It's just a theoretical. There's not much empirical work. And what empirical work we did? But the idea is that this is what the airport is going to be. It's an idea. The airport, the aerotropolis is a concept. And so what this does is this diagram breaks down that concept into interfaces around the airport city to see if that to break it apart and to evaluate it. An analytical framework, so this is a conceptual framework because it's kind of a concept. An analytical framework takes your methodology and looks at how you're going to break it down and study it. So it's more of a methodological approach so that you can evaluate it. So conceptual framework takes the theoretical and empirical work together. An analytical framework takes that framework and puts method to it to evaluate it. That's why it's analytical. So what we might do to build an analytical framework, we might say, all right, governance. How do we break down how the governance is working, for example, with stakeholders? And that's what I'm going to talk about. And your analytical framework breaks it down so you can measure it and evaluate it. That's the difference. One is a sort of a diagram of the concept and the empirical work around that concept. You know what I mean by empirical? Yes? No. Say no if you don't know. Absolutely no shame in not knowing. Mucho shame if you don't know and you don't tell me. So if you were my students, I'd be asking you, but I won't do that to you. Empirical. What is empiricism? It's what we can measure. It's the studies that my empirical analysis of mask wearing in Surabaya at SIT is that about 98% of the students during my lectures wore masks. That's empirical because I've observed it. I haven't measured it yet, but let's pretend I did. And I can say that during my visit to Surabaya, almost all students wore masks due to COVID. In Australia, 0 wear masks. So that's an interesting comparison. Well, guess what? That's empirical. I even have pictures to prove it, right? So empiricism is what we've measured and what we've confirmed. And the accuracy of that empiricism is in our methodology and how mine is not very accurate, but the photos we took yesterday confirm it. We had pictures of all the students. So that's empirical. So what I want to do is look at the governance aspect and build an analytical framework to measure that. Okay? You with me? If you're not with me, if I'm not, so my view is if you don't understand me, I'm not doing my job. It's not because you don't know, it's because I haven't got it through to you. It's like talking to teenage daughters. Often it's pretty clear to me what I need to say to them, but often they look at me, my daughters, with a blank stare. And I know I'm not getting through to them. Now, it's never my fault. So if you don't understand something, ask me, okay? Because it's my fault, not yours. So let's look this idea of governance. All right, don't look at those slides. Close your eyes. What do you think governance is? It's a whole area of research. I had 3 professors that specialized from the School of Business in governance. They used to bore me to death. But what is governance? Well, it's more than governing. It's not about government. It's a word that determines how we proceed. It's a direction set. It's how resources are allocated and how decisions will be made and by whom. So it looks at, for example, in planning here in Surabaya, what are your governance elements? what do you look at? Who governance? Who makes decisions on planning? I don't know, you tell me. The city? Is that a governance element? The state? How about the region? What are the elements that determine your legislation? That's governance. So does the city of Surabaya have a plan? A city plan? Yeah? All right. That's one form of governance. Because the city plan tells you what, where, when. How about the state? Does the state have? Yeah, it does. How about the region? Is there a regional plan? I'm getting puzzled looks. Yeah, exactly. So the state, yep, you should know that. You should know the different governance elements. So the bottom line is it's not management, which is about implementation. It's about the whole picture. Governance is the whole picture. Who has the right to legislate? How many levels of government are there? Who makes decisions within the government? Which departments? Who does what and who decides? It's the whole package. Governance is huge. My daughter is in second year planning. I had a dickens of a time trying to get this idea through to her. It's the bigger picture. So in Australia, governance is determined by the Commonwealth government, the federal government. It controls borders, water, oceans. It controls environmental assessment, but land use is designated by the state government, and it gives the municipalities the right to plan. If the state doesn't like the cities or the municipalities, it can take that right away, but most often it doesn't. Then your municipalities determine land use plans, determine city plans, determine all of that, right? Waste. And also the state has environmental assessment as well. So your governance moves down. Airports in Australia are controlled by the Commonwealth, the federal government. So when the airport is here in this circle, that's Commonwealth. It's not state and it's not municipalities. It's governed by the Commonwealth. That's a unique kind of idea. But I bet it's very close to here. I'll bet you the Commonwealth here, the country of Indonesia, governs the airports. Why do you think that's the case? again, this is part of the conceptual framework. So we've gone from the airport metropolis and the interfaces, and governance is one of them. And then we break down governance. We just keep going. As a researcher, you start just chopping it up. So in governance, the literature breaks it down into domains. There's different domains of governance. First, we look at ownership. Is it public or private ownership? Are there shareholders you're reporting to? The Adelaide Airport has to report to Canadian shareholders. Now that makes a difference. Who you report to and what the shareholders
Domains
take
of
has an
governance.
impact and how that operation occurs.
First, we look at ownership.
If they
Is it
take
public
all
or
profit,
private
there's no
ownership?
profit to
Are
expand
there
the airport.
shareholders you're reporting?
So ownership is very important in terms of governance domains and how it occurs. Then there's the corporations that own airports, like the Macquarie Bank, which is it's strictly interested in money. It's not interested in the community, not interested in airports. It's interested in profit, and that's how they operate. That has its own problems when you have operators that are only interested in money. It's just like cities that only operate around economic development and don't think about environment or social structure, right? So the corporate culture, the reporting lines, who says what to whom, and the internal business model is critical as to how an airport or any other business operates. And that governance domain has an impact. I've worked with CEOs that just have no time for the public input. I am the airport operator, I am the CEO, and I know better than you people. And why are you talking to me about airplane noise? I don't care, because my airport is of national significance. So that's very common. It's very, won't last though. So the corporate element of governance is critical, especially in our society where it's becoming more predominant. More resources are owned by private companies now than public. 50 years ago, the public domain owned more resources. Now it's private. It's the way of the world. Then there's this notion in terms of governance domains of networks and how networks work. Think of a network as a net cast and the relationships within that net. So networks really are relationships between local, state, and national governments, how they talk to each other. In Australia, the state governments and the Commonwealth government, largest logistics companies in the world. That's serious stuff, because Toll can move all of their equipment off an airport to another one. And that happened in 2010. In a Brussels airport, the large logistics company said, "We're not happy with you." And the airport goes, "So?" And they said, "Well, we're moving." "No, you're not." And they did. They moved all their operations right across to another airport. Everything. And the airport lost billions of dollars. They lost flight revenue and they lost logistics revenue and all the things that the city lost as well. Everything changed very quickly once they moved across to Germany. They set up in Leipzig Halle, which was a brand new airport, gave them a better deal, and that's where they operate from because they gave them a boot into Russia and a boot into Turkey. Whereas where it was in Brussels was very inconvenient. And then once the airport started giving them a hard time, that stakeholder left, and it cost the airport billions. And they still haven't recovered. So the stakeholders and communities and other corporations and interrelated players have a huge impact on the airport and the governance of that airport. So governance, you can see, is not just legislation and planning and who gets to say what. It's much more than that. It's a very complex relationship. And it's like your lives. You guys aren't, we have the same thing in our life. What controls what we do and our relationships with people and family is powerful. Well, it's no different for corporations and airports. tell you what might be a better relationship here is if I go like, no, it's not working. There. Are you going to change it for me? How about I point at you and you change it, okay? That's better. That pointer is not working. So what we're seeing now in governance is there's what's known now as contested domains. So the domains are the areas, the different areas of governance. And now those in the 21st century, those domains are now being contested. In other words, things are changing, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. But things are changing, and there's open conflict, a lot of conflict. So we're seeing in Australia, the deregulation of airports to privatized companies has created a huge change in the way airports do their business. So the deregulation from the 80s, from Thatcherism and from that Reaganism saying economics needs to succeed, we shouldn't have any public regulations around it, the market will decide. Well, guess what? It does decide, but it discriminates and it doesn't allow much to fall back to normal people. It's usually corporate profit. Increased calls for a wider array of stakeholders in airports is very, very much the case. We're seeing stakeholders get sick of how airports operate. And so when you get that change, it creates what's called a crowded domain. An example of this is about a year ago, the Prime Minister appointed me to a committee with a former premier, a senator, and a multimillionaire that ran the Commonwealth Games. We sat on a committee to evaluate the impact of the new runway. Brisbane just opened a new runway before COVID. Then COVID came and no planes landed. But then after COVID, in 21, the planes started landing on the new runway. Well, the stakeholders around the airport all started banding together and forming a national stakeholder group and complaining about how the airport was being run. And these stakeholders had a high degree of salience. They were CEOs of mining companies. There were very senior senators and very, very senior gas company executives that had had enough of the airport saying, we're operating in the national interest. And so they formed an alliance and complained about the flights and how the airport was managing the flights. And this is a federal jurisdiction. So they appointed us to oversee Air Services Australia and how they were managing the flights and how the impact was being felt with the community. And it created ripples right across Australia. And now, as a result of the evaluation and what we did, there's going to have to be an operational plan, not just a master plan, but an operational plan of the airport in terms of managing flights in and out. And it's been very serious. We almost shut down the runway. That's billions of dollars of revenue. So it's a very serious change. So these crowded domains, in terms of stakeholders, has changed the way airports operate and the way they are going to operate in the future. So we need to understand what the relationships are between stakeholders and how best to manage them as an airport if we're an airport executive. So this means then in our conceptual framework, we need to go to network governance and understand network governance. In other words, the complexity of governance in networks around the airport. So because there's a more dispersed form of decision-making and a wider array of stakeholders out there, it changes. And we need to look at the functions on different operating principles amongst the stakeholders. We need to look at interpersonal relationships, common interests, and mutual visions that bind stakeholders. It's much more difficult than it used to be in terms of airports. And you know what? Airports, what I'm saying also applies to any infrastructure. It applies to highway development. It applies to anything being built at a large scale. Railway stations as well. I believe it was in Dusseldorf recently that the community closed down a fast rail proposal. There was supposed to be a fast rail terminal in Dusseldorf, and the community all banded together and got rid of it. Didn't happen. The Willy Brandt Airport in Berlin, brand new airport, big, beautiful airport. I toured it, never opened. They spent billions, and it's probably one of the nicest airports I've ever seen. It's still sitting there, no planes on the runway. The municipalities around the airport all banded together, all the mayors who are very powerful at the federal level shut it down completely. The Germans all banded together. The stakeholders are very focused. That airport still sits there as abandoned infrastructure. It'll never open. So there's a new horizon out there where stakeholders get together and band together in networks and try and control their environment. In Dusseldorf, the stakeholder committee, I met with them in Dusseldorf. The head of the committee was a professor of physics. There were 5,000 members, stakeholder members in that committee, 5,000. That is power. When you can band together that many people with a high degree of education, that's not to be sneezed at. And when you have airport managers there that are not skilled in dealing with these complex problems and just saying, no, doesn't work. Because the first thing they do in a democracy is they go to their constituents and they have them educated and they vote against the airport. It's very powerful. And this was what was happening in Brisbane when we took the committee. And it's happening around the world for airports. They no longer have the freedom to do what they want as an independent piece of infrastructure that's state-owned. It's over. So it becomes critical for these airports to try and understand the complexities out there in terms of stakeholders. And they need to move across from cooperation to collaboration. Now, we're going to move into stakeholder analysis because we've got our conceptual framework. Governance is one of them. Now we're going to move into stakeholder collaboration. So, in academia, we as researchers, you must always be precise, especially with words. So we look at words such as cooperation, coordination, and collaboration. We look at words like this. They have distinct meanings. Distinct meanings in academia and in the literature. So, the idea is that cooperation is the lowest level of stakeholder engagement. Coordination is the next level that increases stakeholder engagement. And lastly, collaboration is the highest level of stakeholder engagement. So we go from least down to most, okay? You can also use this with your boyfriends, girlfriends, husbands, and wives. If you're just cooperating in your relationship, that's a very low level. If you're coordinating, that's better. But if you're collaborating, then you have a good relationship. The same with stakeholders, right? So if we go across to the risks and rewards, it's low risk to cooperate. It's increased risk if you coordinate, and it's certainly high risk if you collaborate. And if we look at this thing, time is, if I'm going to go across, time to establish cooperation, it's short term. We'll cooperate while I'm here, but I'm going to fly back next week. the actions and mechanisms, it's independent outcomes, it's autonomous, you have collaborations, you network a little bit together. That's what we're going to do, but I hope we'll get beyond that. Low intensity, low sort of density around level exchanges, very informal, okay? As we move down, look at this, the time becomes more, the actions become much more focused, and the level of stability and what you do as you move into collaboration is you move outside traditional function areas. It's new. It's something we haven't done before. It tighter linkages, higher density relationships. So again, this is a conceptual framework that maps out types of relationships with stakeholders. And it's sort of interesting. And one of my guys, Robin Keese, put this together in 2006 around the airport. Does that make sense to you? You could apply this to anything, actually, in terms of stakeholder engagement. You could apply this table. And it's empirically based. There's a lot of research behind this table. So, did you see that? So we're seeing within these policy domains and these governance domains an overlap between conventional governance and network governance. We're seeing governance change over time. And in the last decade, it has really changed in most democratic countries. We're seeing conventional governance, which is independently focused airports, which relied on rules and regulations, and it was internally focused, and stakeholder engagement was limited. We're seeing that change quite a bit across to a network governance space. And both spaces are important. The question is, how do we overlap to different relationships, wicked problems, complex problems, a wider array of people being involved in this stakeholder engagement, and how do we become interdependent with our stakeholders? How do we share power? So that overlap is happening now. We're seeing quite a change in governance models in most countries around the world. So, when you're analyzing, so we've got our analytical framework, collaboration, cooperation, and that table. When we're looking at that, there's three common approaches to doing that. First, you identify stakeholders and ensuing salience. You know what I mean by that? You identify who's out there and who's who in the zoo. Who are the tigers and who are the monkeys and who are the mice? So it's power. Secondly, you differentiate stakeholders and you categorize them. You find out who's who in the zoo and what they can do and who they know, because that's important. If the CEO of Toll or any of the large logistic companies is connected to another CEO, for example, of any kind of food company or beverage company, you need to know that. Because if you're going to insult the beverage company and you're going to cut them out, you're going to affect Toll. So you've got to know who's who in the zoo, especially with high degrees of salience. You've got to categorize them, and you've got to know the relationships amongst them. So this is networks. You've got to understand the networks of salience amongst the stakeholders. Why? Because, again, the networks and the way we do governance is changing. It's changing a lot around the world. So the benefits, why would we do this? Why would an airport do this? Well, you build understanding around the airport, and you build understanding around the stakeholders. You share information. Information now with the internet and with a lot of businesses is fast. It's out there, and it's quick to get it. So information sharing is really good. You learn from the public. The public are not just a bunch of dummies. The public and the stakeholders are mostly educated, and you can learn from them by sharing. And it's a far better position to be in terms of sharing, than knocking heads and telling people what to do. So there's an education element that's very important. And also, if there's issues of dispute, you can share that and negotiate that space. So what you want is, in the end, as a corporation, as an airport, you want to make wise decisions that support the community and support your business. You solve common problems, you resolve common disputes, and you build concurrence and support with your stakeholders. It's critical. Both, your business stakeholders, but also your industry stakeholders that support you, also your network stakeholders in government, and also your international stakeholders. It's complex. And if you don't see that, you're not doing your job. So I think the key is building these networks and these collaborative work efforts. It's about coordination and management responsibilities and allocating that and mobilizing resources for that. Also, you have to build agencies, organizations, and staff capabilities around community involvement. You've got to build that. It's more than just having public relations agencies. It's about having members of your staff that build on governance abilities. So there's a lot of challenges to this type of collaboration, a lot of challenges. First, it's difficult to agree on common aims. Often, for example, in the committee I sat on, a lot of the stakeholders just didn't want to hear flights at all. And they would negotiate about times. Well, what about the times you're not home? Can we drop flights in, when nobody's home? Say 3 o'clock or 2 o'clock. Does that offend you? And often there'd be negotiation space, right? So it's difficult to agree on common goals. And it's difficult to have organizations that are traditionally very powerful and don't need to share power to come to terms with that. But it's happening. Often power is perceived to be a major constraint. Although power may be more dispersed than participants realize, the powerful people don't like it. But that'll change. So trust, it's like anything else, is an important component. And collaborators that work together often start, and what we did, we found with the stakeholder groups we were dealing with around the airport, they didn't trust us. They thought the Prime Minister appointed us to just confuse them and not do what they were suggesting. So low trust is often the start. And often membership structures, when you sit on an airport committee or you sit on an infrastructure committee, are frequently very ambiguous. They're complex and they don't have any kind of power. And leadership structures and processes often aren't determined by communities. They're determined by corporate entities and investors. And there's a history to this. And that's why our committee was appointed to oversee the Brisbane Airport, because we were sort of a broad community committee of experts. And the stakeholders didn't trust anything the airport had to say, or the regulated agency, which is called, the federal agency is called Air Services Australia. They're the federal agency responsible for airports. They didn't trust them. So we were brought in to broker that trust. Next one. So determining the relationship with stakeholders is complex. So when you're working with stakeholders in an airport context, in the airport city context, you have to work out, who do you collaborate with? Who do you simply coordinate with? Or who do you cooperate with? How do you set those levels of engagement? And what are the elements that tie you to those different levels? If you're simply cooperating, that's not difficult. But if you start collaboration, it's complex and it's costly. So you have to understand the networks and the relationships among stakeholders. You need to think about how stakeholders are positioned within a network, who they talk to. You also have to understand how relationships are structured in those networks, and you have to understand the strengths and density of those networks. The density is how often people talk and how often they collaborate. Next slide. So, I love that. Again, here we go. What is this called again? What do you call that? A conceptual framework. It's a good one. So when you simply cooperate, this is the simplest thing in stakeholder engagement, you have community-based events. So airports host community-based events. When you coordinate, you have management committees that you share across the board. And collaboration is multi-sector partnerships. So when you look at those elements of stakeholder engagement, from the red, cooperation, moving up, it becomes more complex, more costly, and more power sharing. So what does it look like? So cooperation is fun community events on the airport and within the city to have a presence, right? So it's simple. In Munich Airport in Germany, Manfred, the CEO, I think he's still the CEO, hosts the airport 26-kilometer marathon. And what they do is they host, now it's called the Munich Marathon, and they host the marathon. They set it up and they pay for it. And the marathon runs around the ring of the airport. It doesn't interfere with traffic or anything because that's expensive and dangerous. What they have is they've run a marathon track all the way around the external side of the airport, and it doesn't have anybody on it. And the airport hosts this. It's the Munich Airport Marathon. Wonderful. So it's just one form of integrating with the community and bringing the community into the airport. There's other tricks like this too. Brisbane Airport has an open day and a flight day for members of the public to come in and see how they operate. Different airports have different systems in place to do that. Coordination. So when you coordinate, you build management committees that support the airport's role in the region and within the sort of urban fabric. So there's often airport committees, airport management committees, local economic development committees that are formed to set up the role of the airport with different groups. In Brisbane, the airport paid for an endowed chair of airport research. And they cycled that endowed chair, and it wasn't expensive. You know, they're talking $250,000, $250,000 a year. And they cycled the endowed chair in engineering in my group, and then over to business, to the School of Business. So they moved it around so that everybody got to do it. And what that meant was that researchers could do research with the university, and the endowed chair coordinated that research with the airport and with the university. So it was a good model. In terms of collaboration, this is much more important. So collaboration is much more involved. A good example of collaboration is in Canberra. The Canberra airport collaborated with the regional council to build the access into the airport because they only had 2-lane access into the airport, and the airport was a new airport. They had to build a whole new access into the airport, and they went to 4 lanes. The municipality paid for it, but the airport managed it because the airport was good at managing projects, very efficient, and the municipality didn't have to deal with that. The project went up very quickly. It was a longer-term project, and now the municipality maintains that access, and it was very successful. So you get these different levels. So in terms of collaboration, multi-sector has to share projects and strengths with other infrastructure providers. So it's a good example in Canberra of how they collaborate at that point. There's lots of examples around the world of where airports coordinate and collaborate and share power with neighboring communities. So the other side in terms of coordination is that a strong digital presence is important for the airport. It's important to have open dialogue with the community. And now much of the stakeholder engagement is coordinated through stakeholder networks online, chat lines so that they can stay up with everything and understand everything. So in conclusion, this construct of the airport metropolis has evolved, and it's evolved considerably over the last 2 decades. Airports surrounding the infrastructure is critical to cities. It's critical to a city's connectivity and trade. There's no doubt about it. And strong engagement is critical and takes a very, very wide range of collaborative strategies for this complex form, this city form, and this complex infrastructure. And governance is a very important component to how this airport and how this new type of aerotropolis works. And it has to have, nowadays in the 21st century, a very, very comprehensive stakeholder engagement component. Do I have another slide? Is there a last one, or is that it? Good. So, you know, since COVID, the aerotropolis concept, what it did was change how airports develop the airport area, the airport lands. It made them more revenue in terms of other services, such as retail malls, such as parking, such as auto malls. They're building a big auto mall in Brisbane. There's a lot of changes. Storage malls. The airport has changed a lot in how it does. In 2000, most airports relied on landing revenue from airlines for their revenue. That's how they support themselves. Thank heavens, those airports that allowed a widened range of land uses on the airport happened before COVID, because once COVID hit, those airports that relied on planes landing went broke. Those airports that had other revenue sources, such as malls, such as all those other things, parking, all the other businesses and logistics businesses, their revenue allowed them to survive. And now most modern airports have a wider range of revenue servicing the airport. Up to about 60% now is other revenue sources. It only used to be flights. But now there's a diverse model for the airport metropolis or the aerotropolis that allows those things to happen. And it allows the airport to have a wider range of revenue sources to support itself and to keep itself afloat outside of flights. And as those land uses change and evolve, the revenue sources will also evolve for the airport. But the aerotropolis concept, in terms of being a city center, it's never occurred. What has happened is all the airport has done is develop real estate and revenue sources around that airport to support the operations for flights. But more important is that notion of stakeholder engagement, because of these changes, has forced the airport to engage more with stakeholders and to collaborate more with stakeholders at different levels. And that has become very, very difficult for the traditional airport operators. And my guess is that in Asia, it hasn't hit yet, but it will hit. It will hit in terms of having to collaborate more with the stakeholders and not have a state-based approach, decreeing what the airport will or will not do. Okay, questions?
Well, right. So, Mas Himawan, can I ask you to monitor the questions from the Zoom participants? For those of you participating online, you can type in your questions or comments in the chat box, or you can also unmute yourselves and ask directly. And as for you guys, you're more than welcome to raise your hand. To be honest, I will never look at airports the same way.
Thank you very much, Sir the speaker, and my name is Hilal. It's a really good presentation, and I think I want to ask about uh, the concept of aerotropolis is really good, and what are the side effects, the shortcomings of this concept, like the sign that we should not have airport city, but because I think this concept is not for every city. Like um, Frankfurt, Frankfurt City Airport isn't applicable to every city in this world. So, what are the shortcomings of this concept?
Well, a lot of airports have modeled themselves around the airport city in Asia. The airport city probably is more dominant than in Asia than anywhere else in the world. Um, Originally, Schiphol in Amsterdam was the original airport city, and they decided they weren't going to do it because they were sued by the Real Estate Association in the Netherlands, arguing that they should not have to compete with the airport for real estate development, because that's what the airport was doing. It was developing real estate. And so that ended their tenure as an airport city, and they became the environmental airport, right? They changed their model. So China has embraced the aerotropolis concept hugely. They've, the big airports have developed real estate. They have developed infrastructure around the airport to support logistics and to support the airport model of development, which is alternative funding for the airport corporation. Singapore Airport, Changi, is classic. They are now developing a lot of real estate around Changi Airport to support their revenue sources. But really, it hasn't evolved. The aerotropolis has not evolved like Casarda argued that it would, an entire city into itself. Hasn't happened. Not at all. Brisbane Airport called itself the airport city, but really it's not. It just has a mall there. It has some real estate it's developed. But what's good about that model, what's interesting about that theoretical model about how the airport would dominate, was that it allowed the airports to develop real estate in a fashion that suited their needs. Many of them developed, at Brisbane Airport, they developed their own mall, shopping mall. They developed a lot of businesses, car rental businesses, and businesses around the airport that would support airport revenue because they owned the land, or the Commonwealth owned the land, and they leased it. And they were able to lease out the land cheaper than the surrounding city. And Brisbane City took the airport to court, and Brisbane State and West Park Malls took them to court in a famous case in 2003 or 2004, and tried to sue them for developing their real estate. But the airport won, and they were allowed to develop their real estate. And that changed everything around the world. So the model is, you see it here and there. It's not in the United States because Federal Aviation Act doesn't allow airports to develop businesses other than for aviation purposes. So the model is very limited. But what's good about the model is that it allowed airports to flex in terms of the businesses around And it also allowed them to start to engage with communities differently than they ever had. So it's a different kind of thing. But stakeholders really caught on to the airport being much more than just a place to drop planes. So it had its purpose, the theory. And it never panned out to what Casarda argued it would, but it did change the way we did business. That theoretical idea had a lot of force, a lot of power.
Okay. Did that answer your question? Awesome. We have a question from Etta. She's an alumni from the department undergraduate program, and she's well traveled. So she says that she sees Singapore and or Dubai as successful projects because of their strategic location and the reputation of the airlines that they have. Singapore Airlines, Emirates, Etihad, and etc. And you mentioned about Bali and the tourism industry and the amount of traffic flying to and fro. So what is the factors that can influence the success, the make or break of an airport city?
So in the case, let's say, so the reason the airport city can be success to be implemented, in the case of Bali, I think that it's pretty clear that that is the destination airport in Indonesia. And the airport, I love it when you come into that airport. I'd never been to Bali before. You know where you are. The architecture in Bali is very distinct. It's very Indonesian, and I really like that. So my argument would be that Bali itself could be a hub destination point, and it could model itself around that by having more businesses that catered to the tourist industry. So there's no reason why the airport wouldn't have a very unique tourist-based industry to take people to different destinations within that context. So the Bali airport city could easily design itself around tourism and connections to regional Indonesia. I don't know why it wouldn't. It makes sense. And it's just common business sense. So that model certainly, that's a good question. That model certainly would work for a limited sort of tourism approach for Bali. Good question.
I guess every airport or every airport city needs to find its own drivers for success. There's no template for there is no template for success.
Yeah, good point, Nanda. There's no blueprint. There's the theoretical model that Casarda lays out with the airport in the middle, and then businesses and trade hubs and hotels. That's a theoretical model. But to take that theoretical model and to apply it to Dubai it'll be different than Frankfurt, which is different than Leipzig Halle, which is different than here. It's all different. It's contextual, and it depends on what you need in each context.
Perfect. But Etta, does that satisfy your question? Or do you have any further comments? Or perhaps while we wait for your response.
No, sir. It's already clear. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Leipzig Halle, isn't that where the budget airlines fly in and out? Right?
Yeah, Leipzig Halle is a brand new airport. The Germans built it as a sort of hub. And it's very smart because they connected the cities of Leipzig and Halle and Dresden.
Dresden, okay.
Yeah, they're all there, and they all threw in, and Volkswagen has a massive presence there, and the large car companies use it. Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
Ilman, yeah.
Thank you, professors. To be honest, this is quite new things for me, so thank you very much for sharing with us.
My pleasure.
Yeah, of course, this will change us the way we see airports, the way we evaluate airports in terms of its relations with the city. My question is, first, As you mentioned before, this Aeropolis is the concept is uh, a gate, yeah, a portals to mainly for business and for tourism, for example, in Bali case. And my question is, how far this Aeropolis, even though this is still a conceptual idea, but I think this is applicable economically. And my question is how far this Aeropolis can attract investment, especially from overseas, a big investment to develop this kind of Aeropolis in terms of becoming a hub or a gate, portal for their business to broaden their business development, reaching the new market and so on. So does it have to be the locations or the density or what kind of markets that needs to be focused on, something like that. And,
Good question. Yeah.
and
So that's the, I talked about governance in this. That's the other part of the conceptual framework, economic development, right? So that's one component. So economic development is a big driver for countries. And the reason that the Aerotropolis concept was so dominant and such a driver in the early part of the 21st century, in 2010 to 2015, it was a massive driver for Indian airports and also for Chinese airports, because it offered that notion of increasing economic development at a global scale, right? And Casarda uses the example of Texas Instruments being built in the Dallas-Fort Worth airports, DFW we call it. It's one of the biggest airports in the world. So they manufacture Texas Instruments there. Well, they don't do all the components there. DFW doesn't do all the components. Elements of Texas Instruments, computers and calculators, are made all over the world. And they're flown from China, Indonesia, and Germany in 8 hours. So they get components from all of these other airports, all these other hubs, and they're assembled in DFW, but it's immediate. It's normally when we're doing something, you put it on a truck or a vehicle and it goes to the manufacturing plant and it's delivered there in a day or two. Everything is fast. And he calls it the survival of the fastest. And airports do that. They provide that speed. And so you take a 787, you load it up with parts, and it drops up at DFW, and there you have all the hardware, digital parts from, say, Indonesia. The components in terms of other elements from Germany, and they bring it all together. So economic development is a driver. It's a huge driver. But the question is then, why Bali? DFW makes sense because that's the home of Texas Instruments. But why Bali? What does Bali have that people from other countries, say Brisbane, should come to? What do you provide? And that becomes the key at the global scale. What is the edge that Bali provides? So if Bali is going to be, if we're looking at economic development, the obvious answer is tourism. It's one of the biggest tourist destinations in the world. So why not develop around that? So what I would look at, if I were looking at Bali Airport, I would look at other recreational hubs. So where else, I'm going to turn it on you, where else is tourism big? Where's the big destination points?
Indonesia, apart from Bali, I think, yeah.
Where else though? What other models would we look at?
In Lombok, so
No, we have to go elsewhere. I want you to go totally out of here.
not in Indonesia.
Nope.
Okay.
Where else? Where else is big tourism?
Venezia.
Where's the biggest destination in the world? I didn't know that. I had to look it up. What's the biggest tourist city in the world? Where do everybody go? Any guesses? None. Paris? Yes. Give him an A. Paris is the biggest destination. All right, well, what's Paris do? How does that airport manage that tourism? That's what I'd be looking at. How does, how does de Gaulle Airport, how does it look? What do they do there? What's the next biggest destination? Close, no chicken. New York. Yep, New York. How does New York manage that at their airports? So I'd be looking at, but New York's different and Paris is different because you're selling old in Paris. You're selling old and elegant. New York, you're selling raw, new, modern, cutting edge, Broadway. We're not doing that in Valley. What are we selling in Valley? The beautiful natural environment, right? So who else does that? Well, what are the Canadians doing? What's Calgary do? Because they sell the Rocky Mountains, bears, right? Beautiful vistas. What other airports are marketing the natural environment and how do they market it? Africa, look at what Africa does. So that's what I'd be doing in terms of economic development. I wouldn't be just messing around with looking at Indonesian airports. I'd be looking at the big airports in other tourist destinations and how they structure their airport. Durban is a good example. I'd be looking at Durban's airport because it's very, very progressive. So that's the answer to your question.
Thank you, Professor. My second question is, if I may.
Yeah.
My second question is that I see that this kind of development that because this is like giving a multi-use nodes, right? Multi-use function, business, hotel, recreational, can be education sometimes. Why not? Yeah, but I think without fixed settlements because people don't live there. People just come and goes. It's like this is not a fixed society. It's like a mobile society.
Very much so.
Mobile society. So I think this will lead to creating more like generic city instead of like traditional city.
Yes.
Yeah, this kind of generic city development. I want to know, according to your opinion, how can this generic city collaborate, not only cooperate or coordinate, but collaborate with the existing well-established traditional city?
That's a super question, and it's not well done. It is not well done. Some airports do a good job. Munich does a great job. I think Frankfurt does a good job. Brisbane doesn't do a good job. And how you link with the city around the Bali Airport and how you build that connection in terms of workers getting there and in terms of industries connecting is critical. And so if we develop Bali around a tourism focus and that one component of the airport, say, manufactures surfboards. Do you guys surf? Yeah, you surf in Bali. I've seen lots of boards. So if they manufactured surfboards, let's say it's outside the airport, it may have an element on the airport that sells the surfboards. So that when you go through the terminal, there's a shop that connects to the terminal for the latest and hottest colors with the most modern batik designs, right? Why not? So I think that because that airports are a threat often to city centers because they take business away. That's why Brisbane City took the airport to court. And they own 20% of the airport, so they took themselves to court. But they took the airport to court for taking away business. And right now, Brisbane Airport, they drive me nuts. It's my students now that are managing the real estate, and they're developing an auto mall where you can have, they have a racing track to test your cars, and they bring in all the large car companies, and they have them there. And they can be open on a Sunday because they're not regulated by state or municipal laws. They're operating on federal laws. And so they stay open on a Sunday. Well, that's when most Brisbane residents like to go shopping for their cars is Sunday because you shop for the kids, you get all your groceries on Saturday and you're tired. And then on Sunday, well, maybe Martha will go look for a new family car and I know where to go. Let's go to the airport. And they're going to take away all the businesses out of the city and the city's not happy. So that link is really important. And if you don't get it right, you get conflict. And the city, don't ever underestimate the city because they're powerful and they regulate all the land around the airport. And very soon, the roads going to those airports are going to get dilapidated and not maintained. And the city goes, oh, gee whiz, we didn't put that in the budget. That's too bad. So that's important.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions, perhaps, from our Zoom participants? Nothing on the chat? Or maybe does anybody have a raised hand, a virtually raised hand? Can we see the participants?
Oh, we got a lot. We have 17 out there. They're
I
very
know.
quiet, eh? They're all muted.
Some of them are in meetings, and I know one is in a meeting with the with the vice governor of East Java at the moment.
Excellent.
Anybody here? Okay. It's funny that you mentioned you mentioned how the city regulates the land around the airports.
Yeah.
In the case of Surabaya, it's not the city that owns the land around the airport. It's the military, the Navy, as a matter of fact.
Ah,
Yeah. So the airport itself is owned by a government, BUMN itu apa ya? A state-owned corporation.
yep. Yeah.
A state-owned corporation, but the land on which it sits and around it is owned by the Navy.
Okay. So that's interesting. Yeah, they'd have a different view, and the stakeholders from the Navy, they're totally different than the airport people, because airport people are often military and engineering. That'd be an interesting study if you want to do a master's. That'd be a good one.
Yeah, so I guess that would be that could be a factor in on itself
Yeah.
that influences the success, the make or break of an airport city, especially in the case of Surabaya. Because just a few weeks ago, there was a development proposal that went through the planning forum of a hotel that wanted to make an extension. And then we had a look at the land use, and all of the land around that hotel, military land.
Yeah.
And we said, we don't want to do, we can't touch military land. It's all up to them. As long as they're okay with it, then yeah, you can expand your hotel.
So the stakeholders in that case, there wasn't a strong collaborative effort. Yeah, it was very, very much cooperation at the least. Yeah, that's the old traditional network structure, but that will change. If your airport wants to compete, it'll have to change, because that airport's got to compete with some amazing airports around this region. And the new capital city will also have a very interesting structured airport.
Oh yeah.
So look out. Surabaya has an opportunity at this point to maybe get a niche that nobody else has. So I'd be looking at what a fascinating study that would be.
We should
Yeah.
do something about that. Yeah.
You could do something like opportunities and barriers to the development of Surabaya Airport in the 21st century. Mind you, yeah. I don't know why you wouldn't do that. That would be pretty interesting, pretty political though. That's the trouble with research. If it gets too close to politics, it gets shut down pretty quickly. But that's okay.
I'm more afraid of the military though. But-
Yeah, me too.
All right. Zoom participants, how are we doing?
All pretty quiet.
Oh, yeah. Very shy. Anybody else?
Have you got your conceptual frameworks ready for me? No, that's great. Just think of drawing it out and what your conceptual framework could look like when you're looking for accessibility, when you're looking at any of the elements you want to look at. What does it look like? Draw it out. And then think about what the literature, how it guides you in that.
All righty then. I guess if there are no further discussions from our virtual participants and our participants here, I think we can I think we can conclude this session for
Excellent.
today.
Yeah, I'm getting hoarse anyway. Okay, thanks, guys. Thanks for listening to
Well,
me.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Yeah,
Douglas.
that was fun.
Well, for those of you joining us online, thank you very much for your active participation. And we've just ended our session. You may leave the virtual meeting room and have a nice day. Thank you very much.